Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie. And in this video, I want to look at April 2026. And the main part of this video will consist of my forecasts for the 12 signs. Now, in the thumbnail, you'll notice that I've talked about April as being the cruelest month. And that comes from the poem, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And he starts his poem off by writing, "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers." So what is that really talking about? I mean, no one knows for sure, except the poet. But, there is something cruel about April in the sense that it is a time in the Northern Hemisphere of life, of hope. It's the beginning of spring. And so there's plenty of scope for disappointment. We expected things to be better. We expected, winter to be over. And you look at this April. This April, we've got the war in the Middle East. We've got war in Ukraine. There are other parts of the world which are destabilizing. Global economies are apparently collapsing. Yeah, this is not exactly a very spring experience. And one of the things going on in April is a conjunction between Mars and Saturn, and that's a really tough conjunction, especially as it is connected with Mercury as well. So we've got this triple conjunction, and yes, I think that conjunction could be quite cruel. So I want to start off by just looking at the overall planetary picture for the month, some of the main events, and then I want to sort of perhaps look at things a little bit geopolitically, but I don't want to spend too much time on geopolitics in this video, and then the main part of this video will be me going through the 12 signs. So here are the positions of the planets right at the beginning of April. Set for midnight on the 1st of April, the very beginning of the month. So the first thing we notice is that Venus is in Taurus. So the month starts with Venus in a great position. Venus, in its own sign. And, Venus moved into Taurus on March the 30th, or perhaps March the 31st, if you're in Australia or New Zealand or East Asia. And so, that's certainly a good way to start this month off. Venus is, after all, the lesser benefic, fortunate planet, and it is applying to a sextile of Jupiter, and this Venus-Jupiter sextile, it becomes exact on the 13th. So through that first half of the month, the two benefics, very well placed. Venus in Taurus, its own sign, Jupiter in Cancer, in its exaltation, are coming together. And I know things might seem a bit grim. I mean, I'm making this video, at the end of March, and things do look a bit difficult. But maybe there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Even though I do think in some ways it could be the cruelest month. Venus sextile Jupiter does indicate that for some of us there may be opportunities, and when we're thinking about Venus and Jupiter, as individuals, we have the opportunity for making the most of this. If we're talking about politicians, and we're looking at things from a geopolitical angle, well, it's more difficult. We're not fated because we're individuals. Who cares what happens to us to an extent? But from a geopolitics angle, then maybe the die is cast. And also, while Venus is making a sextile to Jupiter, we have a trine between Mercury and Jupiter. So, right at the beginning of the month, I think it's on the 3rd of April, Mercury is trine Jupiter. So Mercury's in Pisces, making a trine to Jupiter. So Jupiter's in Cancer, and this aspect could be about communications. How we get our message across. But this trine, it's in water signs. It's not like it's in air signs. So it's not necessarily talkative. And there are many different ways of communicating. We can communicate through our feelings. We can communicate in a telepathic way. We can communicate through our silences. So just because Mercury is trine Jupiter, it doesn't mean that we have to talk our heads off. And the month actually starts off with a full moon. So this full moon is in Libra. And so this gives us the idea of balance. So the sun went into Aries at the time of the equinox, around sort of March the 20th. So you think of sun in Aries, in its sun exalted in Aries, wanting to make things happen, being very initiative orientated. We've got to be the first mover. That's great. But then it comes across the moon. Moon in Libra is representing something different, an alternative approach. Moon in Libra is saying, well, actually, you've got to consider the other person. You can't just go storming in. There is this idea of balance. And so with this full moon, many of us might realize that we have gone too far, that we've got to allow diplomacy to work. And of course, from a sort of geopolitical point of view, diplomacy matters. People do have to talk, and maybe that is the challenge of this full moon. But when you're talking about Libra, there is a fine balance, and it is easy to upset this balance. And so the month really starts off quite powerfully, and there is an argument to say that the month does start off quite well. I mean, with this Venus sextile Jupiter, Mercury trine Jupiter, and then we have a new moon. So around 2 weeks after the full moon, the moon waning through the first part of April, we get this new moon in Aries on, I think, the 17th. We've got a new moon at or is it the 16th? Something like that, 16th, 17th. We've got a new moon at 27, 29 Aries. So this new moon, I think it's the 16th, this new moon, actually. So this new moon can represent a new beginning, although it's in late degrees. It's 27 degrees of the sign. So that's not quite what you expect with a new moon. And I do think these late degree new moons that we've been having are of the nature of a full moon, and they're about recognizing that something has come to an end. And when we're talking about endings and beginnings, we can't have a new beginning because we want a new beginning with a new moon, but we can't have a new beginning until we've recognized that something has reached its sell-by date. So something has to be got rid of so that we can bring in the new, and that might be the message of this lunation. And then I talked about April being a cruelest month. We've got a Mars-Saturn conjunction. So we've got a Mars-Saturn conjunction taking place. It's on the 19th of April, and here is the chart for this conjunction. And so this Mars-Saturn conjunction, it takes place at 7 degrees 52 Aries on April the 19th. I mean, don't worry about the precise time. It's sort of early evening Eastern Standard Time, but it doesn't. I mean, let's not worry about that at the moment. But the thing about this Mars-Saturn conjunction is that it's conjunct Mercury as well. So we've got a triple conjunction. And yet Mars-Saturn, oh, you might say Mars and Saturn are about structure and discipline, but let's not kid ourselves. I mean, Mars and Saturn can be very difficult. They can be about frustration, things not working out. They can also be about death and destruction on a global level. You know, as individuals, you know, we have more choice. You know, we can decide how we're going to use a Mars-Saturn conjunction. So if we're concerned about a Mars-Saturn conjunction, we can perhaps take exercise. We can do something strenuous, but of course we mustn't overdo it under medical supervision and all that. But you know, we can perhaps work off our frustration. But from a global level, you know, it can be difficult, and there can be some really negative thoughts with this Mars-Saturn conjunction because Mercury is involved. You know, Mercury on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, thoughts about death and destruction and how bad things are. Again, I'm not saying we have to be part of it, but it just could say something about the environment. And yes, it could be quite cruel. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why this April might be one of the cruelest Aprils. I'm not saying that absolutely has to happen. Now, at the end of the month, we have got Uranus moving into Gemini, and I'll try and make a video about just looking at Uranus in Gemini. But you know, it is a big change. We did have Uranus in Gemini briefly last year, and it went back into Taurus, but now it's in Gemini for real. And so with Uranus moving into Gemini, it's very different from Uranus in Taurus. I mean, Uranus in Taurus is quite willful. People really believing in things, not being prepared to compromise. Maybe it contributes to the divided society in which we're living. I'm trying to be optimistic here. Maybe with Uranus in Gemini, people can be more flexible. And you know, you think Uranus in Gemini, you know, that should be quite positive, and you know, you think about variety. Although, you know, the problem with Uranus in Gemini historically is that, you know, every time Uranus is in Gemini, the United States finds itself at war. I mean, Uranus was in Gemini during its war of independence against Britain. It was in Gemini during the Civil War. It was in Gemini just after the Second World War. I mean, Uranus was in Taurus at the time of Pearl Harbor, but later on in 1942, Uranus moved into Gemini, and now Uranus is in Gemini, and as we can see, United States is again at war in Iran. But you could say, well, United States is always at war. So is this war any different? Well, I don't know. Uranus is in Gemini. It is a bit of a problem, but I don't really want to spend too much time, you know, talking about geopolitics in this video. Now, one way one can look at a month, I'm not saying this is a particularly good way of looking at a month, is to say, well, how does a month start? And one way of asking is one way of doing it is to set a chart for the precise beginning of a month in a capital city. So here is the beginning of April, when March becomes April, midnight, April the 1st, 2025. I've set it for Washington, D.C., the capital of the U.S. And the moon is in Libra, and Mars is, you know, it's quite close to the IC. Now, that's going to be the same for a lot of places. So, you know, around midnight on April the 1st, it doesn't matter where you set it for, whether you set it for Moscow, Beijing, Tokyo, you know, Mars will, you know, be quite close to the IC. And, you know, having Mars close to the IC, that just might say something about April. It might. You know, it's, you know, we know that there's a lot of violence going on. And we know that the foundations of things are being really undermined, particularly by the war in Iran. Is it going to sort of sort itself out, by magic? I'm making this recording on March 29th, March 30th, so we're not there yet. I think it's unlikely that anything dramatic is going to be decided, over the next couple of days, that we're suddenly going to be at peace. I think that's unlikely. But the fact that Mars is on the IC does make this month, potentially, rather difficult, and yes, perhaps rather cruel. And so we can set it for another capital. So if we set this chart for Tehran, so this is the beginning of the new month, set for Tehran, the capital of Iran, and so the IC is at 22 degrees 30, and Mars is at 22 degrees 58. So that same message. In fact, Mars is even closer to the IC than it is when you set the chart for Washington. And when you set the chart for Tehran, the moon is not in Libra; it's in Virgo, and so the moon is opposition Mars, and so that is a bit difficult. That's a bit scary. That does give us an idea about the violence of this month. So maybe the Middle East, it's particularly difficult. Or we can set that chart for Jerusalem. So if we set the chart for Jerusalem, you have moon opposition Mars. Mars is really close to the IC if you set the new month for Tehran. Not quite as close. If you're into true black moon Lilith, you might notice that I use true black moon Lilith. I do not use mean black moon Lilith, and there can be a huge difference between true and mean black moon Lilith. But I prefer the true black moon Lilith, and true black moon Lilith is I make it at 14 Sagittarius. I hope my program has got it right, and that indicates black moon Lilith, right on the ascendant if you set the chart for Jerusalem. But Mars moon is still that moon opposition Mars. So this Mars on the IC reminds us of Trump's inauguration chart. So here is the chart for the moment Trump became president. I mean, I've set this for midday on January the 20th, 2025. That is the legal moment where he became president. I don't know when he took his oath, maybe a few minutes either side. But the chart for Trump becoming president had Mars exactly on the IC. So there was a signature of war right at the beginning of his reign. Okay, if you have a negative view of Trump, then you might see it as his reign, his presidency, however you want to see him. So Mars is on the IC, and it's not Trump's fault. Whoever became president on January the 20th, 2025, if Kamala had won, Mars would still have been on the IC. So, we should stop personalizing this. It's not... Trump is just an instrument of the cosmos. When he's acting as president, that's why I don't really get this concept of Trump derangement syndrome. It would happen anyway. Trump is a force of nature. Let's not make it personal. The point is, whoever was going to be president, was going to be inaugurated, there would be Mars on the IC, and Mars on the IC, is clearly a signature of conflict and things not being peaceful. Okay, that conflict could be conflict within America, within the United States. It could be global conflict. And the fact that Mars is on the IC in all those charts for the beginning of April, I just do think that that's interesting, and it does resonate with Trump's inauguration chart. So, those are a few thoughts about the general sort of astrological picture, what April might be like. And now I want to look at things from the perspective of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for April 2026. Aries. So many things going on, and you're not quite sure how to respond. Part of you wants to just withdraw. Why should you be at the centre of things? You've got better things to worry about. other people might have their dramas. There might be a huge amount going on in the world. But, part of you thinks, why bother? Perhaps you need to think about, the important things in your life, like your home and your family. And, ever since Jupiter went into Cancer, last summer, I think that in many cases, your family and your home and your security have really mattered to you. And at the same time, there is this sense of responsibility. So to what extent have you got surplus energy? But then you are an Aries, and you've always got more energy. Particularly now, the month of April, it starts with the sun moving through your sign, and it is the Aries season. The sun is moving away from a conjunction of Saturn. So, the end of March, you might have felt that things were holding you back. You're still very much aware of them, but maybe there's a feeling that you have more freedom. And what are you going to do with this freedom? Well, it's important that you look after it and you ensure that no one gets in your way. And then that brings us to the first sort of big event of the month, sort of April the 1st, April the 2nd. We've got a full moon in Libra. So that full moon, Aries, falls, right across the main axis of your chart. And, with this moon in Libra, Aries, you might be, very much thinking about other people and your relationship to them. Maybe there are particular relationships which have been taking up a lot of your time, and now you have moments of reflection. And when you're dealing with full moons, you often have a chance to see the truth about other people might have been hidden. You weren't sure, and now with the full moon, truth is fully available, and that might mean that you start to see someone in a more positive light. You recognize that someone can do you the world of good if you give them a chance, and could work the opposite. It could be that you realize that some people have limitations. Maybe people you've spent a long time with over the last weeks, months, even years. You now see who they are, and you see their limits, and you do have to think about yourself. And we're dealing with the issue of selfishness. Selfishness, is a word that is often connected with Aries, and I think that's okay. It's nothing wrong with being selfish. All of us have to be selfish to an extent. All of us, we live in a sort of dog eat dog world, and this full moon might remind you of your own selfish interests and how another person might be undermining them. Yet, full moons can work in several ways, and it might well be that you recognize that you can't do everything on your own, that you maybe need to look at things in a new way, and the right people could really be of great assistance to you. And as the month progresses, the Aries emphasis does increase, and one big event taking place this month takes place on April the 9th, when Mars moves into your sign. So Mars has been in Pisces for quite a few weeks. I think it's around 6 weeks, I don't know, something like that. And Mars in Pisces, it wasn't so bad. You had a degree of strength. Mars works pretty well in Pisces. Mars rules the water signs. And so, you were fairly aware of what was going on emotionally. You might have been more sensitive than usual, but there was still, something holding you back. And now that Mars is moving into Aries, that does represent, a big change. Mars is a whole way you present yourself, the way you feel about yourself. And so with Mars moving into your sign, I think that does give you a great deal of strength. It really does, So there could have been things that you've held back on, you didn't want to do, you felt it wasn't the right time. But now that Mars is in Aries, you have power. Now there is always a danger with Mars moving into Aries that you could take things too far, and that's maybe something you've got to watch. From the 10th of April onwards, or 9th, 10th of April, whenever Mars changes. So I think it's the 9th that it goes, 9th of April. And so with Mars moving into Aries, you certainly have a strong sense of yourself. You believe in yourself. At least you should be believing in yourself. And there's a lot you can achieve, but there could be a danger at a certain stage that you take things too far, and that's certainly something you want to avoid. Now, in the middle of the month, the Aries emphasis increases. Around 14th, 15th of April, Mercury moves into Aries. So Mercury moving into Aries, it's just kind of more of the same. You've got Mars you've already got Mars in Aries. Of course, you've got the Sun in Aries, Saturn in Aries, Neptune in Aries, and Mercury joins it. And Mercury is the planet of communication, and it is about what you say. It's about what you communicate. And Aries as a sign has a reputation for being quite forthright. And with Mercury in Aries, you've got something to say, something maybe quite important to say. However, as Mercury moves into Aries, it starts to make a conjunction to Saturn, and this conjunction between Mercury and Saturn, becomes exact, on sort of 19th, 20th. I think it's the 20th of April. And Mercury, Saturn, it can work in several ways, but Aries, you could be quite harsh. Mercury in Aries likes to say likes to say what is on its mind. It doesn't like to mince its words. And with Mercury in Aries, you can certainly be forthright, but you can use language in a way which could be, frankly, quite destructive. You could use harsh words, even coarse words, and the things you say could be upsetting. That's certainly a way in which Mercury conjunct Saturn, could work. Now, there is a lot going on. It is a busy month for the average Aries, and just after Mercury's gone into Aries, we have a new moon. A new moon at the end of Aries, which it takes place, I think it's around the 17th. So 17th of April, new moon. That can be a new beginning. Now this new moon is at, I think it's at 27-29 Aries. It's a situation we've got where a lot of the new moons we've been having, well, all the new moons this year and from last year onwards, were late in the signs. And they're not quite as late as they used to be, but still 27-29 that is quite late. And I do regard this new moon as being about endings. It's not a full moon. It's not a full moon, and you think, oh, new moon, new beginning. But there's a lot that you've had to think about. There's a lot that you've had to consider. And, when you've got a new moon right at the end of the sign, if a new moon might in itself be about completion, something just coming to an end. But, something has to come to an end in order for something new to start. And, you could say that this new moon represents a new beginning based on knowledge, based on the knowledge that you have gathered, that you have collected. It wasn't always easy, but now you have a real understanding. And this brings us on to really the highlight of the month. Highlight is probably the wrong word, but there is a big conjunction taking place around 19th and 20th, the 19th, 20th of April. This is just as the sun is leaving Aries and is moving into Taurus, and we have a conjunction between Mercury, Mars, and Saturn. And from a geopolitical perspective, from a global view, I think this Mercury, Mars, Saturn is not good. It could be very difficult. It could be destructive. It could be frustrating. So, what about you? How is it likely to impact you? And I do think this is a highlight of a month. I'd like to have a more positive highlight. Maybe it can be positive, but you think about it. Mars is conjunct Saturn. Mars conjunct Saturn, traditionally in astrology, is a really difficult aspect. It can be frustrating. There are things you want to do. You want to be spontaneous, and then Saturn, you could hit a brick wall. And also when we're talking about Mars conjunct Saturn, it can be dangerous. I mean, traditionally there is a connection between the Mars-Saturn pairing and death and injury and so on. I'm not making this prediction for you. I'm just saying you need to take it slowly. And, it's not just Mars conjunct Saturn. Mercury is involved as well. So with a conjunction between Mercury, Mars and Saturn, it all comes together. And, I've already said that you can be quite harsh with Mercury moving towards a conjunction of Saturn in Aries. And so you do have to really sort of watch your language. You might say something that represents your annoyance and your frustration, and it could cause offense. Okay, maybe you want to cause offense. So, think about the words. I think, with your words, you will be effective, for sure. You can force people to take notice of you. And if you've got a complaint, with Mercury, Mars and Saturn coming together with this really quite powerful conjunction, then I think you'll be a good complainer, and you will be able to, at the same time, be really quite attacking. So if you want to destroy someone verbally, or at least take someone down a peg, you certainly can. But, do think it through. Don't feel that you have to push it, and just be aware, Aries, that you're not always going to be a force for good. You can be a force for bad. And it's good to be selfish up to a point, but you could just be too selfish. And if that selfishness is fueled by frustration, then, I think that obviously, would not be good. And I really think you have to watch out here. I think this is a potentially, quite a dangerous situation. And then the last part of the month, the sun leaves Aries, moves into Taurus, and so some of that Aries emphasis is blunted, and you may be able to sort of relax more, and up to a point, but it's going to be difficult to completely relax. Another aspect we've got, right at the end of a month, Mars makes a semi-square to Uranus. I mean, a semi-square is an aspect that, I think semi-squares are quite an important aspect. And Mars, I've just talked about, Mars and Saturn. This Mars conjunct Saturn could be quite a problematic aspect. It can be frustrating, but then Mars moves on, makes a semi-square to Uranus. Uranus will be in Gemini at that stage, so you've got Mars in Aries making a semi-square to Uranus in Gemini, and that might mean that you just want to do something. You'd want to do something quite dramatic. So even though you're trying to slow down at the end of April, there just might still be moments, and right at the end of the month, you just might feel that it's just something you have to do, and you do it, and the results may be quite unpredictable. Taurus. April starts with Venus in your sign. So, Venus went into Taurus on I think March the 30th, so right at the end of March. And so, with Venus moving through Taurus through most of the month, and I think until 23rd, 24th of April. So Venus works very well in your sign. Venus is your ruler, and just you may feel that maybe you're luckier than average. It's important to think about that. As being a Taurus, you can have quite a grim view. You can see how things could go wrong. You're aware that nothing can be taken for granted, and also there is an earthiness to Taurus, which makes you recognize that nothing lasts forever. Everything has to come to an end, and I'm afraid all of us have to die. I mean, not that I'm making any sort of dread predictions here, but with Venus in Taurus, Venus, in fact, doing some interesting things. I mean, one of the first things that Venus does when it moves into Taurus is it makes a square to Pluto. So I think that square is 3rd of April, something like that. So Venus square Pluto. So you've got Venus in Taurus, you've got Pluto square Pluto in Aquarius, and this Venus Pluto square just does remind you that Pluto is in Aquarius. Pluto is a planet which is about transformation. It's about power. It's in a high-profile part of your chart. Aquarius is at the top of the Taurian chart, and so with Venus square Pluto, the first thing that happens this month is that you feel an impetus to make something happen. You're not satisfied with the way things are, and being a Taurus, you're very often aware of the power relations around you. And that in certain situations you don't have much power. In other situations you can use your strength. And with Venus square Pluto, you kind of want to force things through. And so it's, in a way, quite a strong start to the month. And it's important that you really try your hardest. And once you've decided on something, you've decided on a particular focus for yourself, then it's really going to be important that you give it your best shot. And also another thing to remember about this month is that Uranus is in Taurus. Uranus is in your sign for most of the month. However, at the end of the month, I think sort of 25th, 26th, something like that, the last very end of the month, Uranus moves into Gemini. Now, Uranus will not come back into Taurus for 70-something years. So, for most of us, we're not going to see Taurus again. We're not going to see Uranus in Taurus again. I mean, I'm speaking for myself as well. I have got Taurus rising. So, what you're going to do as Uranus moves through the last degree or two of Taurus, Uranus is a planet of individuality, originality, doing something different. It's not about following anyone else. It's about doing what is important to you. And hopefully, over the last 7 years or so, as Uranus has been moving through Taurus, you were able to really do things differently, think about doing things differently. But maybe there's still something that needs to be dealt with, and that's something that you really need to think about. You have to think about yourself and doing things differently and being positive. I mean, I know that to be positive, everyone's told to be positive. Can we really be that positive? And there is a negative streak to every Taurian. What is the point? Because it's all going to come to an end. But I think it is worth your while being as positive as possible. Going back to Venus, Venus is in Taurus at the beginning of April, and it is moving towards a sextile with Jupiter. I think on April the 13th, Venus and Jupiter make a sextile. So Venus and Jupiter are the two most fortunate planets in the solar system. Jupiter is a greater benefic, Venus is a lesser benefic. So when they are in sextile aspect, that's really good. I mean, the sextile is a fortunate aspect. It's quite dynamic. It's not a completely easy aspect. It's not like a trine, but sextile means that you do have to put in a little bit of effort. But if you do put in that effort, with Venus in your sign, Venus in Taurus, Venus in its own sign in Taurus, Jupiter exalted in Cancer, that Venus sextile Jupiter, it really is a great aspect, and it should be great for you. So it's certainly not a time to be lazy. There's always a problem with Jupiter, that with Jupiter you think, oh well, you just have to hang around and wait and something good will happen. I remember when I was doing my first horoscopes for people in the sort of mid 80s, I'd do these written horoscopes, 20 type pages, and I would come to a Jupiter transit and I would be wonderfully optimistic and hopeful and tell people how great it was, their love life was going to blossom, money, career, everything. Of course it didn't happen, and it's made even worse with Jupiter is if you anticipate it, you get really excited. You think, oh, April the 13th, Venus is going to sextile Jupiter. That's going to be great. I don't have to do anything. The universe is just going to give me something. Absolutely does not work like that. You have to almost forget that Venus sextile Jupiter exists. There is, you've got to be positive, but you don't want to anticipate things, and just do your best. Don't expect anything from the universe. And if you do your best, then I think that Venus sextile Jupiter, can be very fortunate, and think about how you can make it. I won't say a certainty, but how can you increase your chances? One way of increase your chances is to communicate. There is something very communicative about that Venus sextile Jupiter, and it's perhaps about making a phone call, sending a message, sending a letter, email, maybe applying for something. You see something is offered, you tell yourself, what is the point in applying for it? For example, if you're looking for a job, you send off an application letter. You just don't know. But with Venus sextile Jupiter, it can work for you. Now, I said that Venus Jupiter sextile, Venus Jupiter sextile is around the 13th. I mean, it's not like the 13th on the dot. It might be a week either side, and even if the aspect is not exact, the point is that this month Venus is in Taurus, where it's in its own sign. Jupiter is in its exaltation. So that alone suggests that this month does look pretty good for you. I mean, but you cannot be complacent. You've got to be dynamic, and the concept of power does matter. Yeah, it does. Think about power. You have the power. You don't have to force things too much. That's true. And so the end of the month, there are a few changes. So around sort of 19th, 20th, the sun goes into Taurus. So the sun, the sun being, in your sign, the Taurus season officially starts. It's a time of year when, Taurians can be, quite sort of open and positive, and they can think about, what is possible. And, you're able to continue with that Taurian drive. So you decide you want something and you just give it everything you've got. And so that does look pretty good. But there is a kind of a mixed sign change going on. So at the end of the month, we got Sun moving into Taurus, So more emphasis on you, but then Venus moves into Gemini. So, the last week of April, Venus in Gemini, okay, it's not quite so good having Venus in Gemini. I mean, you don't have the power of having your ruler in its own sign, but with Venus in Gemini, it does do something interesting. As Venus moves into Gemini, it makes a conjunction to Uranus. So, I talked about originality and the importance of you being original. I mean, I don't mean just being original for the sake of it. That's not what it's about. It's about you doing something which only you can do, understanding your uniqueness. And it's not about fitting in. And with Venus conjunct Uranus at the end of a month, you get a real sense of how you are different, how you want to do things differently. And also, from a financial perspective, I haven't sort of talked about money so far, but in the last part of the month, money issues can't be entirely avoided, and you're perhaps thinking about lots of different ways of making money. This is Uranus moving into Gemini now, and it's conjunct Venus, and you're thinking about what you can do, and you realize that there is a new way of making money, a fresh income stream, as they say. So do explore that, and it might occur to you when you're thinking about money with Uranus in Gemini. Gemini is a two-bodied sign, so it could be that many Taurians come to the conclusion that money doesn't need to come from one source. That there may be several ways of making money, and be adventurous in a financial sense. I don't mean being speculative. I don't mean doing anything crazy or risky with money, but just seeing if there are perhaps other alternatives. Gemini. Well, one thing that is going to happen this month is that Uranus is going to go into your sign. Now, Uranus has already been in your sign briefly. I think last year Uranus was in Gemini. You had a taste of it, but it went back into Taurus. But at the end of this month, it goes into Gemini, and it stays in Gemini. It stays in Gemini for 7 years or whatever, something like that. And this is going to be a time when you can do things differently. Uranus, Gemini, there's a certain affinity between Uranus and Gemini, and you might have a chance to do something really, really different. And that's what Geminis like to do. I mean, every Gemini at some level thinks that they are different, thinks that they're special. We can exaggerate that. I mean, I say we because my sun is in Gemini. I've got a Gemini sun, and if you've got your sun in Gemini, well, it can always be disappointing when you realize you're not quite as special as you thought you were. But anyway, with Uranus moving into Gemini, that's something you can start to prepare for. Maybe you've kept your originality back over the last few years. You haven't really been able to put things into action. But don't worry. Things are changing. Things are moving. Now, as far as this, the specifics of this month is concerned, the month starts with Mercury in Pisces. So, in fact, for the first half of the month, Mercury is in Pisces. And I know that Mercury in Pisces has a somewhat difficult, reputation. I mean, they say that Mercury is fallen in Pisces, because Mercury rules Virgo, is exalted in Virgo. Mercury has a special relationship with Virgo, so when it's in Pisces, things haven't been great. But I don't think it's actually been so bad, and I think there are certain advantages of Mercury being in Pisces. Especially as right now Mercury has a trine relationship to Jupiter. Mercury is in Pisces. It's moving towards a trine of Jupiter. In fact, right at the beginning of the month, I think it's on Friday the 3rd. the trine is exact, but it's still going to be around for the first half of that month. But so, Mercury trine Jupiter. Jupiter is a planet which is very fortunate. It's about good luck. And that doesn't mean, though, that you can just assume that everything is naturally going to go your way. No, that is not the case. But with Mercury trine Jupiter, things will move. And I don't know what you're doing with yourself at the moment, but if you are focusing on success, doing something well, for example, your career or something connected with business, I think that Mercury going through Pisces is quite ambitious. Mercury is also conjunct the North Node, even though Mercury is not necessarily so well placed by sign, it's not so bad, and it just might be that you really do feel that there are things you really can do if you have the chance. And so during the first half of April, as Mercury moves through the end of Pisces, really try your hardest, try to get things moving. And that Mercury trine Jupiter could work from a career perspective. Financially, it may not be too bad either. Maybe recently you've had financial concerns and things weren't as good as they should have been, and you were looking for ways of making money, or maybe you were trying to make money in some direction and it wasn't working. But now that Mercury is trine Jupiter, there is an opportunity there, and it also links with this whole thing about Jupiter being in Cancer. Jupiter's been in Cancer since last summer, and I think that for many Geminis with Jupiter in Cancer, it's perhaps been all about having the right relationship with money, and it hasn't always been easy. But now with Mercury making this trine, maybe things are really starting to come together. You're feeling better, and you're feeling optimistic. Optimism on its own is not going to do much. You've got to put in the work. But if you do put in the work, then I think that things should work pretty well for you. And then Mercury changes sign. So Mercury changes sign 14th, 15th of April. And so with this sign change, it matters because Mercury is your ruler. And so with Mercury changing sign, well, for one thing, Mercury is moving out of Pisces. So Mercury is moving out of a sign in which it was in its detriment, in which it was fallen. And so by position, Mercury is better. It's better placed than it was. And additionally, it's moving into a fast sign. Part of the problem that Geminis can have is that they can think too much. There can be just a little bit too much analysis, and you're thinking about this, and you're thinking about that, and you overanalyze things, and then nothing happens, and it all comes to nothing. But with Mercury moving into Aries, and Mercury stays in Aries throughout the last half of the month, suddenly you have more energy, more enthusiasm, more get up and go. And this might say something about your social life, and how you relate to other people. You can be exciting, and you can even initiate. Part of the problem that some Geminis have is they don't initiate because they're into thoughts and theories, and taking actual action isn't necessarily what you're always particularly good at. But I think Mercury moving into Aries is something that is very much to be welcomed. Now, I just want to backtrack and say something about that Mercury trine Jupiter. And I talked about Mercury trine Jupiter, a few minutes ago. Now, one of the problems I have when I do my 12 signs stuff, usually my videos I just do it for the on a dailies, and this monthly forecast is a bit experimental. I don't know whether I'll do one for May. I'll see. So one of the things that supposedly people want when they have their horoscopes read is they want to know about relationships. Are you going to find love? What about romance? And it's an area that I tend to neglect because I believe that astrology and love should not mix. And that might sound controversial. And let me be clearer about that. If someone is in a situation where they are not in a relationship, or they are at the very beginnings of a relationship, astrology is not helpful. I'm absolutely convinced about that. Particularly if astrology is being used to feed fantasies. And, it's just, it's not helpful. And so I think there is a good argument for steering clear of relationships and astrology. Having said that, I just talked about Mercury being trine Jupiter. So the beginning of a month, Mercury, your ruler, is trine Jupiter. Jupiter is ruler of Sagittarius. It's your opposite sign. So classic astrology, classic 12-sign astrology would say Mercury trine Jupiter. That is great for relationships. Relationships can really work. And for the first half of April, one-to-one relationships can be a source of happiness, joy, and fulfillment. I'm exaggerating, but I'm just saying that a lot of astrologers are going to say that, and it is difficult. But maybe I have that responsibility to tell you about the Mercury trine Jupiter. Maybe if you make the effort to link up with someone, then it really can work, and it should be quite easy because it's a trine. But you shouldn't think beyond the situation, because I just don't want to create disappointment. And in terms of existing relationships, if you're already in a relationship, then I think that Mercury trine Jupiter, is pretty good. So if there have been recent misunderstandings between you and your partner or your spouse, the Mercury trine Jupiter provides sort of easy communications. It's very easy to say things. It may be easy to get back in touch. Of course, if you're dealing with a trine, it can just be a bit sloppy with a trine. It's just a bit too easy. But I do think handled properly, that Mercury trine Jupiter could work very well. But, relationships are not just about love and romance. They can be about partnerships, business partnerships, for example, doing something with another person which can be beneficial and profitable. And I think in that sense, I think that the Mercury trine Jupiter during that first half of the month can be very useful. Now, going back to Mercury and Aries, the fact that Mercury goes into Aries the last half of the month. Now that sounds good, and it is good. Nothing wrong with that. It gives you a lot of sort of inspiration and get up and go. But there is a slight problem, and it's not just your problem. It's a problem for all of us. Is that around the 19th and 20th of April, there is a conjunction. There's a conjunction which involves Mercury, Mars, and Saturn. So Mercury's conjunct Mars, Mercury's conjunct Saturn. This conjunction is problematic. I do not think it's a good thing. I mean, it can be a good thing maybe if it's handled correctly. But, you think about it. Mercury makes a conjunction to Saturn in Aries. Well, that can be very frustrating. You might suddenly hit a brick wall. You can't do anything. That's not going to last for long. I mean, Mercury's moving pretty quickly, but there just may be a time during 19th, 20th when things don't move. And also, Mercury is making a conjunction to Mars. So Mercury, hitting Mars, hitting Saturn, being on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So there could just be a moment of real frustration where just things absolutely are not moving, and you could get annoyed. And if that happens, just tell yourself that this conjunction, it's not going to last forever. Give it a few days, and the situation, will start to ease. Don't worry about it too much. But when you're dealing with Mars Saturn, Mars Saturn as a pair, they can be connected with death. Yes, it's true. And I'm not making any dire predictions here, but it just may say something about what you are thinking and what you are communicating. There may be a few days when you have some rather deathly thoughts. It's all doom and gloom and what's it? Shakespeare, Richard II. What's it? I don't know. I don't think I'm quoting it correctly. Let us talk of graves and worms and epitaphs, or something like that. There's everything is grim. Maybe you might even enjoy it. I mean, Gemini's. I'm saying this as a Gemini myself, can quite enjoy just getting into the negative side of things. Going for walks in a graveyard. Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen any good graveyards really in where I am in the US, but in London there are some really good graveyards, and so if you get a chance with Mercury on the Mars Saturn midpoint, maybe a walk in a graveyard can help you get things in perspective. But don't get too caught up in negative thoughts, and maybe you shouldn't inflict them on other people. I mean, okay, you don't want to repress your thoughts, but I'm just warning you about this period from the 19th and the 20th. It may be just an overall larger period, maybe from the 17th to the 22nd of April, where things could be a little difficult. Now, at the end of the month, we have Venus moving into Gemini, and Venus moves into Gemini at the same time as Uranus moves into Gemini. Now, Venus moving into Gemini is something good. I regard it as being good. I mean, Venus is a fortunate planet. Of course, it's connected with relationships as well as money and art. So when it moves into Gemini, you may become a nicer person, at least on the surface. You're going to be able to communicate, very smoothly. I mean, Venus in Gemini, it's not like Venus in Cancer. It's not like you're going to be super emotional about the way you express yourself in late April, but it's just you're going to be able to talk. You'll be relatively charismatic and interesting, because Uranus is going into Gemini as well. So that Venus conjunct Uranus, which will be around that sort of zero Gemini point, it is going to just remind you that things have changed, and you might feel sort of a new life and a new dynamism, because Mercury is still in Aries, in a fire sign, and also Venus in Gemini is trine Pluto, so it does seem that April should end on a very satisfactory and perhaps exciting note. Cancer. Just to remind you, Cancer, that Jupiter is in your sign. I mean, I have to remind you every now and then, because it might get forgotten. And Jupiter stays in Cancer, I think, until June the 30th, right at the end of June. And so, while Jupiter is in Cancer, things should be pretty good for you. Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, so works really well in that sign, and it gives you plenty of good luck. Now, when you look back over the last, I don't know, not a year, but last summer Jupiter went into Cancer, so there have been moments, Cancer, when things might have really been coming together, when you felt lucky. Maybe you lost those moments, and maybe you feel that things aren't going as well as they should be. I mean, perhaps. But Jupiter is now direct. I mean, Jupiter turned direct, quite recently, and so no longer retrograde. And so with Jupiter moving through Cancer, you are lucky, and you continue to be lucky. And it's okay. It's nothing that is necessarily specific about April, although I think early April, things are actually looking quite good for you when we consider what Jupiter is doing. But I'll come on to that in a moment. Now, the key event at the beginning of April, in fact, what April starts with, is April starts with a full moon. Maybe that says something about the month for everyone. So we've got a full moon at was it 12 degrees 21 Libra. So this full moon might be challenging, Cancer, because it makes you think about your priorities. So if we break down the full moon, that means we've got the sun in Aries, opposition the moon in Libra. So with the sun in Aries, still fairly close to Saturn in Aries. With that, you are thinking about the way forward, where you want to go. Your ambitions are important to you, and I believe your ambitions are going to stay important for you in a particular way. Over the next couple of years. Remember, Saturn stays in Aries until 2028, and so that is something you may have understood. But then you get this full moon, and when you've got a full moon, it can be rather challenging. It's kind of saying, well, have you thought about it like this? Maybe there's another way of looking at things. Have you really understood it all? And the full moon might talk about, pressures perhaps coming from your family. You see your family or your home in a new way. Full moon in Libra. Perhaps you've been starting to realize something, and then suddenly you get it. You may have an understanding about your home. It doesn't matter whether you own your home or whether you rent it. You see it in a new way, and you see the pressures of your family and your home in a new way as well. And then you might be thinking about the home-work balance. While I think it is a time, Cancer, where you really can be very successful. You can move forward with your aims. Perhaps your career, if you have a career, or your job, whatever it is. Yes, I mean it is looking good, but the full moon is presenting you with something different, a different possibility. And then just after the full moon, we have a square between the Sun and Jupiter. I think the Sun-Jupiter square is actually on Easter Day, Easter Sunday. So that means we've got the Sun in Aries square Jupiter in Cancer. And I think that square is something that you should really work with. Squares are often seen as being unfortunate, but I don't think this square is at all unfortunate. You think about it, you've got the Sun exalted in Aries, you've got Jupiter, as I've just been explaining, exalted in Cancer. So even though it's Easter Sunday, I don't know what you're doing on Easter Sunday. Maybe Easter Sunday is just a normal day for you. I don't know, but you do have to think about your priorities here. And I think that Sun Jupiter square, with that Sun Jupiter square, it may really occur to you that there's something you need to do relating to your ambitions. And of course, you've got to also consider the message of the full moon. And so you are thinking about the pressures upon you, different priorities, but still, there's something you can do, and you also know that you can do it very well. And I do think that this ambition continues through that first part of April, because you've got Mars moving into Aries, and that is a big deal. So I think it's on the April the 9th that Mars moves into Aries. So that means you're going to have Sun, Mars, Saturn in Aries, and that really does say something about your ambitions, because it's now Mars, and Mars is a very aggressive energy. And it happening just after the Sun square Jupiter, I think it really is something that you want to achieve, and maybe you're prepared to push yourself pretty hard in order to get what you want. But maybe it won't be so difficult, because one aspect we do have in early April is a sextile between Venus and Jupiter. In fact, this Venus-Jupiter sextile is exact on the 13th. And this is Jupiter. This is Jupiter. Remember, Jupiter in Cancer. Venus in Taurus, sextile Jupiter. That really does mean that you can feel good about yourself, and it's not just about ambitions, getting your way. It's actually quite a pleasant aspect, and it might be that you can enjoy socializing. You can be with other people. I think that people are going to like you. I mean, Cancerians are always pretty good, or often pretty good at making friends and maintaining their popularity. Cancerians, Cancer is a very sensitive sign, can understand what people want, what people need, and can often provide it, and is very good at showing enthusiasm. That's something that Cancerians can do. They can show enthusiasm about something that they are absolutely not interested in. Maybe a Cancerian goes through an interview and they know what the interviewer is interested in, so they feign interest. Yeah, it can be effective. And with this Venus sextile Jupiter, I just think that you just come over as being a pretty pleasant person, but all the while you are thinking about your ambitions. Again, I'm not necessarily talking about career. Whatever these ambitions are, we all have ambitions. You have your ambition. It doesn't matter how old or how young you are. You have ambitions, and there are things that you regard as being important. And it is a time when you really need to sort of force them through, or maybe you don't have to force them through. Do whatever it takes. And then we got a new moon on about the 17th, something like that. Mid-April new moon. New moons, full moons, it always matters to Cancerians, because the moon is your ruler. You're sensitive to the lunar cycle, and this new moon taking place at the end of Aries, it might be a feeling that but something has kind of come to an end. And I know we don't normally think about endings with new moons, but this new moon is very late in the sign, so something is coming to an end. But you can also feel that something new is starting to emerge, and it's becoming clearer and clearer, and it's something that you maybe want to devote yourself to. And so although first half of the month you are quite ambitious, I think you're very ambitious, there's always scope for something new to come into your life, perhaps to have a new ambition or to dedicate yourself to something. And I think you can very much do this with the new moon. But it's not as easy as that, is it? It never is. And arguably, the big event of the month is a conjunction between Mars, Saturn, and Mercury. And it's difficult to know how it's going to work. But this Mercury-Mars-Saturn conjunction, it's in Aries. Aries, cardinal sign. It is important for the average Cancerian, and it's tough. Mars and Saturn. You put Mars and Saturn together, and that could create problems. It really could. It could be incredibly frustrating. And certain people could be frustrating. Relationships could be frustrating. Someone might be cramping your style. You may feel that something has to give, and perhaps it all follows, because it follows on from a new moon. So the new moon is about perhaps you dedicating yourself to some new ambition, but then straight after that, a couple of days after that, you've got this Mercury-Mars-Saturn conjunction. And okay, it might be about geopolitics, but on a personal level, you perhaps realize that if you want something done, it's going to take twice as much energy as you thought you needed to expend, maybe 5 times as much energy, maybe 10 times as much energy. And you then realize that it's all or nothing, that if you want something, you're going to have to give it everything you've got. And the question is, are you able to do that? Do you have the energy and the resilience to do it? And so that might say something about that whole period from maybe the the 17th through to the 23rd of April, when when things are tough, but maybe it's a good thing. Maybe you realize what you can do if you give yourself the chance. Leo, it's often a good time of year for Leos. After all, the sun is in Aries for most of April. The sun is exalted in Aries, and of course, the sun is your ruler. So there's plenty to be optimistic about, and you're enjoying the fieriness of the sun. So that's you need fire. Every Leo, to some extent, needs that kind of energy, that kind of intuitive power that the sun in Aries can provide. Now, the first thing that happens in April, I think, is a full moon. And the full moon matters to you. I mean, after all, a full moon is moon opposition sun. And so that full moon could represent a challenge. So, Leo, you might think that you've got a lot of things sorted out, that a lot of things are coming together. You're making connections, and you're able to fine tune some of your beliefs, and it's becoming clear. You thought it was becoming clear, but with this full moon, something might occur to you. You realize that things aren't necessarily quite as simple as you thought they were. It just may be a few details, a few facts. You thought you understood the facts, but there's extra information that needs to be integrated. So it's important, Leo, that as you start the month, you don't believe that you've got everything sorted out. You haven't found the entire truth. Maybe you found part of the truth, but not all of it. And the full moon, if handled correctly, should be very constructive. It should point things out to you, and you can start to see that you might have made a few mistakes in the past, but they're the kind of mistakes that can be corrected. Now, another thing, if we think about the beginning of a month that's going on, is that Venus is in Taurus. In fact, Venus went into Taurus on March the 30th. And Venus in Taurus, from a Leo perspective, is very good. I mean, it's a good place for Venus. Taurus is an important sign. Taurus is a fixed sign. Leo is a fixed sign. And with Venus moving into Taurus, you're starting to think about, what is possible. You would like things to be possible, and now things are coming together. Okay, you have had to make some adjustments, and I think that full moon was about making adjustments. You thought you were all set, but now there are a few changes to be made. But if you are open to criticism, you're honest with yourself, then I think that this Venus in Taurus is going to work pretty well. And it's important that beginning of the month you are open-minded, that you don't worry too much about other people. I mean, one aspect that we do have at the beginning of the month is a square between Venus and Pluto, and this Venus-Pluto square could be about rivalry. Just another person who it might appear as if they're trying to get the better of you, or you might believe they're trying to get the better of you. And it could be something taking place, at work or in a professional environment. There's always rivalry. We live in a competitive environment, but don't exaggerate. Just because someone appears to be a problem doesn't necessarily mean they are a problem, and it's important not to jump to conclusions. And overall, if you are pleasant and reasonable, and you keep smiling, then things should be fine. And Venus, as it moves through Taurus, it doesn't just make a square to Pluto, it makes a sextile to Jupiter. And this sextile to Jupiter, I would regard as something very positive. I mean it's positive for all of us, but I think it could be particularly fortunate for you, and it might say something about success, how to be successful, what kind of approach do you need to take. And I know, Leo, that you very often like to be the center of attention. Or maybe, I know that there are quite a few Leos who are complete introverts and don't like being the center of attention, but certainly the textbook Leo likes to be the center of attention. But probably with this Venus sextile Jupiter, it's lucky. It's a fortunate aspect. It's exact on the 13th of April, but I would have said that probably through most of April, certainly that central part of April, the middle third of April, I think that Venus sextile Jupiter really should be working for you. It does seem, Leo, that there are things that you can do behind the scenes that other people might not be particularly aware of, that you do it and you make the preparations and it just it all works out, and in the process do think about your own originality. It's important to be original. It's important to do something that makes you stand out. You've known this for a long time. And it's perhaps connected with the fact that Uranus is in Taurus. So you've got Venus in Taurus, you've got Uranus in Taurus, and so you're thinking about what does make you special, and really work on that, because Uranus is not going to stay in Taurus forever. In fact, at the end of a month, Uranus moves into Gemini, and it won't be back in Taurus for best part of another 80 years or so, just under. So do things slightly differently, maybe. Okay, you don't want to be obsessed with the idea that you are in the right, and I think that the full moon at the beginning of the month should have given you some of the extra information you need, but overall your own private maneuvers could turn out to be very successful, and they can really help move things along. And the Taurus emphasis does continue through the month, because 19th and 20th we have got the Sun moving into Taurus. So that is when the Taurus season has officially started, and with the Sun in Taurus, you're going to have Sun in Taurus, Venus in Taurus, and Uranus still in Taurus. This really is a time to really be yourself, and to think about all the things that you could achieve, and don't forget about your own power. Your power does matter, and you don't have to be so worried about other people. People are there for you, and you shouldn't regard everyone as being a rival. Now, one thing I do have to mention is that around the 19th and 20th of April, there is a conjunction between Mars, Mercury, and Saturn, and this Mars, Mercury, Saturn conjunction, it could be troublesome. I think it could be troublesome for everyone, and it may be that something happens which disappoints you. You might think that you had understood things, that you had an idea about the way things were moving, and then something might happen which really is disappointing. You thought you'd worked it out, but events illustrate that maybe you haven't. And so don't be too complacent about your own beliefs. Circumstances might occur which might force you to revise these beliefs. I mean, don't worry about it too much. And by the end of the month, with the Sun in Taurus, I think that this is Sun in Taurus. The Sun, it's your ruler. With the Sun in Taurus, I think then this is a time when you can probably be more of an extrovert. I think earlier in the month there was certainly an advantage at times of doing things in quite a secretive way with that Venus sextile Pluto. But by the end of the month, I think you can be very definite about who you are and what you want to achieve. Virgo. Mercury has been in Pisces for some time, and it's in Pisces for the first half of April. And so, when we're thinking about Virgo, what's going on in Virgo's life, one has to pay attention to Mercury. And Mercury in Pisces is very much about other people. I mean, after all, Pisces is your opposite sign, and so when Mercury is in Pisces, you do have to consider what it is that other people want. It doesn't mean to say that you have to give it to them. You just have to be aware. You have to be aware of what people are thinking, what people are feeling, and giving people an opportunity to say whatever it is that's on their mind. And it may not be something you want to do, but it is the right approach, because you have to learn about other people. You have to know about their strengths and weaknesses, and also how they might be a threat to you. Again, I'm not saying they are a threat. I'm just saying that is one possibility. And Mercury in Pisces is making a trine to Jupiter, and so that's in fact the first big aspect that takes place in April. Okay, I know there's a full moon on the beginning of April, but I wouldn't worry about that too much. It's the Mercury trine Jupiter that you need to think about. And Mercury trine Jupiter, it's a great aspect. Jupiter is a benefic, and so with Mercury trine Jupiter, that might mean in a general sense that you are luckier than average. And because Mercury is in Pisces, in your opposite sign, it's possible that some of that good fortune comes from other people. It's what other people have to offer. And it's quite possible that some people have a lot to offer. So don't underestimate people. And if someone has let you down in the past, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to let you down in the future. And you, at the same time, you don't have to do everything on your own. You might think that you have to do everything on your own, that other people can't be trusted. But there are certain things which can be done in a team. Whatever you're doing, wherever you are, whether it's your social life, your career, whatever, do give people a chance. And when you're dealing with Mercury trine Jupiter, it is a classic aspect relating to relationships. And so relationships is always an area that I'm worried about, because I don't like to give anyone false hope. Because it's such a delicate subject, relationships, particularly if you're talking about love and romance and things like that. It's so easy to get people worked up about something and get them excited, and then we discover that, or you discover that it's just a load of hype. That's absolutely not what we want. But still, I do think that this Mercury trine Jupiter could work well for you, and I think it might suggest romantic good fortune. Again, I have to say that, but if romance is something you're looking for, then the chances of finding the right person or an existing relationship improving are very high with this aspect. And then in mid-April, around the 14th and 15th, Mercury changes sign. Mercury moves out of Pisces and into Aries. This is something of a mixed blessing. In some respects, Mercury moving out of Pisces, is a good thing. Mercury, is fallen in Pisces, so moving into Aries, having that sign change, may be a big relief. Mercury has been in Pisces for a long time. And over the last couple of months, you might have found that other people were perhaps having too much influence on you. You were having to spend too much time worrying about what other people were doing and what they were saying. And having Mercury moving into Aries, might give you more freedom, but it also might give you more perspective. You can start to see things in a different way. Maybe there were subtleties you were missing out on, and then with Mercury moving into Aries, you're able to make connections. Mercury, Aries. Aries is a fire sign. It could be quite inspirational. Seeing things with new eyes and being able to get into things in a way that is, which is deeper, and understanding the complexities of the situation, whatever that situation might be. But just because something is complicated doesn't mean it's a problem. In fact, I think you'll be quite glad to look at things in an in-depth way. And it's not going to be so difficult. You just have to make those connections. You see how two things which appear to be completely unrelated to one another, it suddenly fits together. And that might relate to another person. You're trying to judge another person, and you see, for example, two unrelated behaviors. How do these behaviors fit? And then suddenly it makes sense. Now, Mercury, when it moves into Aries, it does start to make conjunctions to it makes a conjunction to starts making a conjunction to Saturn and Mars. And so what we have around the sort of 19th, 20th of April is a big conjunction involving Mercury, Mars, and Saturn. Now, this conjunction may not be particularly easy. It could be quite intense. You think, Mercury, your ruler, on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. When you think about Mars-Saturn, you can think about frustration, things being difficult, having rather strange thoughts as well. Thinking perhaps about the negative side of things. I'm afraid, Mars-Saturn does have a connection with death, and that might be something that you are thinking about. There's nothing wrong with thinking about death. I'm not saying anything terrible is going to happen, but thoughts about the finality of everything might start to cross your mind, and it's not a problem. Maybe you want to talk about it. Maybe other people don't want to listen, but it's always good to be able to look at things in a different way. And I mentioned in the introduction, April being the cruelest month. There is something dark about April. We think it's supposed to be a month of sort of growth, new beginnings, at least in the new hemisphere, in the beginning of spring. But we have these hopes, but they can be so easily dashed. We expected everything to be wonderful, and then it's not wonderful. We may have found that the winter was easiest. At least the winter was honest. The northern hemisphere winter was honest, but there was a certain deceptiveness to the spring, and maybe that is something you feel. But it's not just you; it's everyone. And perhaps you're ahead of the crowd. You understand the inner dynamics, and that might actually give you an advantage. Now, something very important happens at the end of April, and that is Uranus moving into Gemini. Now, Uranus was in Gemini last year, and I don't know how it was. Did you feel the power of Uranus in Gemini? Maybe you got a glimpse of it, and then it sort of dissipated. What does that mean? Uranus is a planet relating to revolution, change, and also inspiration. And Gemini, Gemini is a sign which kind of has a connection with Virgo. I mean, Virgo and Gemini, both ruled by Mercury, and so with Uranus moving into Gemini and staying in Gemini, stays in Gemini for, I don't know, the next 6 years or so. So you've got a chunk of time while while Uranus is moving through this sign, and this could be about your whole self-conception, self-perception, how you perceive yourself. And so you are looking at the path ahead. Perhaps you've been on a path. Maybe it relates to your career, your ambitions, and you followed this path, and so far so good. But with Uranus moving into Gemini, there's a disruptive element. You're starting to think, is this the right place to be going? Maybe you'd like to branch off in a different direction. And at the same time, if you're in a job, you've got people above you, and you're working for someone, you're part of a hierarchy. You may not be able to accept things like you did before. You might be actually quite rebellious, and so do think about your career, your business, your overall direction in life with Uranus moving through Gemini. And it's not like you have to do anything like now this minute, because Uranus is going to stay in Gemini for quite a long time, 6 years. But just over the next few years, you might want to change things in quite a dramatic way, and in a way that isn't typically Virgoan. Virgo has a sort of textbook reputation, a stereotypical reputation, for being quite sensible and doing things in the proper way. But I think that might just be a stereotype, and it's not necessarily true. And if you want to be a rebel, Virgo, I really think you can do it. Libra. It's the Aries season, isn't it? That's how the month starts. In fact, the month starts with a full moon. Well, it's actually a full moon in Libra, but there's an Aries relationship there, because you've got the sun in sun in Aries, moon in Libra. They're opposite one another. And you feel the Aries energy. You have been feeling the Aries energy since the equinox. When the sun moved into Aries, when the sun moved into your opposite sign, and very often this is a time of year when Librans are thinking about the other, perhaps the other people in your life, looking at how you might not be in full control. There are people you have to pay attention to. They might sort of tell you what to do. You find yourself having to be considerate, more considerate than you would like to be. And then with this full moon, which is taking place at the same time as Venus moves into Taurus, because Venus moved into Taurus right at the end of March, on sort of March the 30th or March the 31st if you're in Australia or New Zealand or East Asia. So there is a change here, and the full moon. When we think about that full moon, at the beginning of the month, it's about awareness. It's you being aware of what you can do, and also being aware of other people, what other people are up to, and maybe being able to understand people, like never before. You might have a sort of an inspiration about someone. The scales fall from your eyes with this full moon. Of course, there is a full moon in Libra, every year, and this full moon is, it's always a time of truth, when you can see things, for what they really are, and it is taking place, just after Venus changes sign. So Venus, your ruler, has moved out of Aries. So while Venus was in Aries, it could have just been more of having to accommodate other people. And now, when Venus moves into Taurus, it's different. With Venus moving into Taurus, and Venus stays in Taurus until I don't know, 23rd, 24th of April. So for most of April, Venus is in Taurus. So that does make you more intense and better able to understand what other people are doing, and you're not satisfied with just looking at things on the surface. You're prepared to ask some interesting questions, and if you don't get the answers, well, even if you don't get an answer, that gives you an answer. Other people's silence can tell you a great deal. And while Venus is moving in Taurus, remember it's a time when you are strongly placed, because you've had Venus in Aries until March the 30th, and Venus in Aries is not the best place for Venus. And you may have felt at times that you just weren't on best form. Maybe it was just easier for people to push you around with Venus in Aries. But now that Venus is in Taurus, that gives you just an understanding of the way things are working, and that gives you the ability to just reconfigure your social life, your relationships, and that may be how you should see the whole period between the full moon on first 2nd of April, and the new moon on the around sort of middle of the month. It's the 17th, something like that. That new moon. So there is that period of just having to take things on board, and that whole period when the moon is waning. So when the moon is waning from the beginning of April onwards, it's not necessarily a time when you absolutely have to initiate anything. That can come later. It's more of a time for reflection and to really be thinking about the power balance. But you are getting stronger. And one thing about Venus moving through Taurus is that it is making a sextile aspect to Jupiter. And this Venus-Jupiter sextile, it becomes exact on around the 13th of April. And I would have said, first half of the month, this Venus sextile Jupiter is definitely benefiting you. And you think about it. I mean, Venus is in Taurus; it's in its own sign. Jupiter is in Cancer; it's in its exaltation. And Jupiter is a fortunate planet. So is Venus. So this Venus-Jupiter sextile really does make you lucky, but it's a kind of luck that is not sort of in your face. It's not sort of an obvious luck. It's not like walking down the street and being showered with gold or anything like that, or finding a pile of cash just lying around, or suddenly becoming a star. It's not like that. It is more subtle. It's what you're doing behind the scenes in your own quiet way. And the more you're prepared to do things without necessarily talking about them, you start to discover the facts that matter. And once you understand what's going on, Libra, that really does put you in a good position. And you know where you are vulnerable, and if you know where you're vulnerable, that means that you can stay out of trouble, and you also know where the opportunities lie. And so I really think that the first part of the month, it doesn't seem to an outsider that anything is really going on with Libra. Libra seems to be quiet, but all the while things are going on. You're starting to work things out, and it's a good idea over the course of a month, throughout the whole month, to be slightly wary of other people. Other people could be troublesome, And you could say that it all sort of culminates, on around the 19th and 20th of April, when we have a rather difficult conjunction involving Mercury, Mars, and Saturn. So, this conjunction involving Mercury, Mars, and Saturn, it takes place in your opposite sign, in Aries, and it could be about other people causing trouble. And, I know that I'm supposed to be positive. I'm supposed to be positive about relationships. Everything's fine. You're going to find the right person. Everything's going to be harmonious, whatever. I cannot be positive about this Mercury-Mars Saturn conjunction. If you just take take things at face value, if you just accept people, if you aren't careful, relationships could be really problematic around the 20th. In fact, I would say the whole period between, say, the 15th of maybe the 15th of April through to the 25th, something like that. So, other people could make your life miserable if you give them a chance, but you have a choice, and it just might be in the mid to late April. Maybe you should just look after yourself. You don't have to worry so much about what other people are doing, and do keep your distance. I think that could be important. It doesn't mean you ignore other people, not at all. You have to be very aware of them. You have to make an effort to understand what they're thinking, feeling, and planning. But don't make yourself vulnerable. Now, at the end of April, the planet Uranus moves into Gemini. Now, Uranus has been in Gemini last year. It was in Gemini, briefly, but now it's moving into that sign at the same time as Venus moves into Gemini, and so Gemini is an air sign, and so Venus, moving out of Taurus into Gemini, being conjunct Uranus, that could be quite liberating. I do think that in many respects April is a potentially quite difficult month. There's a lot to deal with. I think it can be a lucky month, provided you are careful and you don't reveal your hand, and you perhaps kind of work behind the scenes. But by the end of April, maybe the last week of April, just things do get a lot easier, and you start to see what is possible. And Venus is reminding you straight away that Uranus is in Gemini, and Uranus, it stays in Gemini. I don't know, the next 6 years or so, it will be there, and it is a time when you can explore everything that is available. A lot of things are available, and there could be some big changes. There could be changes in terms of your personal philosophy, what you believe in, spiritually maybe, or even politically. I mean, always a lot going on politically. So if you have a set of beliefs, spiritual, political, whether they're spiritual, political, moral, I'm not saying that you're going to have to abandon them all, but they might be shaken up. And I think that is for the best. And you should be open to the possibility of new ideas that might on the surface seem alien and even threatening, but having that broad vision could very much benefit you. And while Uranus is going to be in Gemini for the next six years or so, Venus is making that conjunction to Uranus, and I think that over the last week of April, you start to get an idea about what is going to be possible for you. And I do think, Libra, that quite a lot is possible for you at the moment. Scorpio. The month of April starts with Venus in Taurus. So Venus moved into Taurus on March the 30th, maybe March the 31st if you're in Australia or New Zealand or perhaps East Asia. And Venus in Taurus, Venus is in your opposite sign, and one way of looking at that is to say, well, that says something about relationships, and about perhaps someone who is in your life, or it could be someone who is moving into your life. And so as April begins, you shouldn't make assumptions about the various relationships that you have. Don't make assumptions about particular people. Don't, for example, assume that someone is weak or can be pushed around. Someone who appears to be not particularly strong-minded or strong-willed might show a different side to their personality. And Venus in Taurus can also represent someone new arriving on the scene. So be open to that possibility. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, it's probably a good thing. I mean, Venus, the planet of relationships, is in Taurus, and that does suggest that we're talking about someone who is potentially quite honourable, and someone who could be quite good for you if you give them a chance. Now, also at the beginning of the month, Mars is moving through Pisces, and so Mars is moving through late Pisces, and I think that's a good place for Mars to be, but there comes a point where you are looking for a change. Maybe you have ideas about what you can do in a creative sense. And that has been one of the features of Mars in Pisces. When Mars is in Pisces, it's in a water sign. It's kind of making a trine relationship to Scorpio, your ruler, and so there are plenty of opportunities there. To think about what you are you're really good at, but. Mars is changing sign. Now, that sign change is probably a good thing, And so as far as when it happens, I think it's around April the 9th, Mars changes sign. And it's about Mars moving into its own sign. So suddenly Mars becomes very strong in Aries. And it's, Mars is you. And from a house perspective, Aries is your sixth house. So if we make Scorpio house number 1, Sagittarius house number 2, then Aries becomes house number 6. And in traditional astrology, Mars joys in the 6th house. And so Mars moving into Aries is a double bonus for you. But that doesn't mean to say, oh, it's all fun. It's all about amusement. I think that with Mars moving through Aries, you straight away realize that there are things that you have to do. Mars is about hard work in this situation. You benefit when you're working hard, when you are doing things which require, a great deal of focus. Now that might sound strange with Mars in Aries. You associate Mars in Aries with you being dynamic and assertive and doing whatever you want, and it's not quite like that. And so having a keen sense of detail, Scorpio, I do think is going to be very important, and I really do think that is something that you can get together. And also with Mars in Aries, it's a time when many Scorpios would be advised to pay some attention to their health. I mean, the Sun is also in Aries, and the Sun will be in Aries until the sort of 19th or 20th of April, and so do think about that. I don't know what your health is like. I'm not, of course, giving medical advice. I'm more thinking about sort of lifestyle. But it does seem that there are things you can do to make yourself feel psychologically and physically sort of fitter and in better shape. And it might be about sort of diet and exercise, and also removing yourself from environments which are undermining you. Pollution. What kind of pollution? I mean, the pollution, well, it could come about from chemicals, what you eat. It could just come from people's vibes. And when Mars moves into Aries, it makes a conjunction to Neptune. And so while Mars moving into Aries is a good thing, that conjunction to Neptune, Neptune is the planet of chemicals and additives. So do think about your diet and what you're eating, and what kind of vibes other people are sort of emanating. And if you feel that you're in an unhealthy environment, then you can do something about it. Mars is in Aries. It's a very assertive place for Mars to be. So your primary responsibility is, Scorpio, to make yourself as fit and healthy as possible. Now, as we move through April, as we move into mid-April, what happens is that Mars, Saturn and Mercury start to converge on one another. And around the sort of 19th, 20th of April, we have a conjunction between Mercury, Mars and Saturn. It all takes place in Aries. So Mars and Saturn, I'd love to be positive about it, but it's a difficult conjunction. It can be frustrating. It can in certain situations be dangerous. And you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to get annoyed about something. You don't want to get yourself into trouble. If you find around November the 20th, 19th, 20th, that things are becoming difficult, maybe there are obstacles, people getting in your way, you feeling frustrated, or you might feel that everything is going nowhere. If you find yourself feeling like that in around that date, don't panic. And by the way, I do not want to create a self-fulfilling prophecy here. Just because Mars is conjunct Saturn around the 19th or 20th doesn't mean that anything is going to happen. It's just astrology. I mean, I very often get it wrong. But if you do find yourself feeling frustrated around the 19th and 20th, just let it pass. Let it sort of kind of roll over you, and don't exaggerate. And don't get annoyed, because if you do get annoyed, that annoyance sort of might come back onto you, and it could create a difficult situation. It could create an argument, could create some minor accident. It's not going to do your psychological health any good. So there is, a bit of an obstacle there, which you do have to negotiate. And I'm confident that you're going to be able to handle it. And there is a positive side to it. I mean, with this Mars conjunct Saturn, you're going to be starting to take things more seriously. You'll realize that things can't be trivialized. Now, as a Scorpio, that's something you always recognize. Scorpio, of all the 12 signs, is probably the least trivial. And so you are being hyper serious. You realize that it's not a joke, that you have to really focus, that there's no room for sloppiness, no room for sloppy thinking. And then you have Uranus moving into Gemini in the last week. In the last week of April. Now, Uranus stays in Gemini for a long time. It stays in Gemini for years. And with Uranus moving into Gemini, I think it sort of emphasizes the seriousness of the thing. And it emphasizes how important it is for you to take a serious approach, not to take things for granted. That when you look at complicated things in a different way, you have a revelation. And it really hits you. But it's good, because you're able to take action. that kind of Scorpio action. Not immediately noticed, but in the end, it can be very, very effective. Sagittarius. This month, we have a sextile between Venus and Jupiter. I mean, let's be positive. Let's start off on a positive note. So, the first half of April, Venus and Jupiter are moving towards a sextile because Venus is in Taurus and Jupiter's in Cancer. Jupiter's your ruler, remember. Jupiter's exalted in Cancer, and with this sextile, you're feeling that things are going your way. You just know that things are going your way, even if it's not remotely obvious. It's not like anything is necessarily happening out there, in the concrete world, but you just know that a change is afoot, and you know that it's a change that in the end is going to work in your favor. But you've got to let it happen and not have too many expectations. Expectations can be a real problem. So, if I tell you that, the first couple of weeks of April, you're going to be quite lucky, you might sort of glom onto that and you're thinking, oh yeah, where's the luck going to happen? You wait for the universe to give you something, and the universe doesn't give you anything, and you feel very disappointed, and you feel you've been let down, and you feel I've let you down. And what I'm kind of saying here is that you need to put in the work, and you need to create a possibility for good luck coming your way, but you also have to not assume that you're just going to be given things for doing nothing. And with Venus sextile Jupiter, perhaps you're starting to realize what it really means for Jupiter to be in Cancer. Jupiter, your ruler, has been in Cancer since the summer. I think it stays in Cancer until the end of June. Right at the end of June, I think it moves. It changes sign, moves into Leo, and it's quite a deep, serious place for Jupiter to be, and it's encouraging you to explore your emotions, to accept that some things are not easy. As a Sagittarius, if you're typical of your sign, you might want sort of plenty of variety and excitement. You want things to be simple, straightforward. And Jupiter in Cancer is just telling you, you can't expect that kind of ease. And with Venus sextile Jupiter, you're perhaps seeing for the first time that by being subtle and by not always revealing your hand, you are in a position to benefit. So, provided you handle things in the right way, I'm very confident that early April should really work for you. And also in early April, we have got a trine between Mercury and Jupiter. So this Mercury-Jupiter trine, it's probably a fortunate aspect. Again, it's another aspect that is not very high profile, but it's quite sincere, and it reminds you of the importance of being down to earth. And it could say something about relationships. It might give you an opportunity to develop a real connection with another person, a connection which is grounded, where it's not just some vague relationship where everything is sort of very casual. You understand the importance of something, and it's other people are there. It's not just to benefit you in some kind of material way. They're there to give you stability and grounding, and maybe that's how you should be judging other people at the moment. Do the people around you, do they make your life more comfortable, more reassuring, or are they just creating confusion for the sake of it? And you should be looking for stability, and looking for stability from other people. And in the same way, I think you are able to provide stability. So you've got to, in terms of other people, think about what makes them tick. What are they looking for? Are they looking for money? Are they looking for fun? Are they the kind of people that just get bored quickly, or are they looking for something more sincere, something more stable? And those are the kind of people I think that you should be looking for. So all of this looks quite positive at the beginning of the month, and but by the end of the month, something quite interesting is going on, and that is that Uranus is starting to move into very late Taurus, and in the end, it moves into Gemini, and so does Venus. So last week of April, we've got Venus and Uranus in Gemini. Gemini is your opposite sign. And Gemini is a sign that it's often associated, with relationships. So I've already talked about relationships in one way. Relationships as being about stability. Can people provide you with stability? But with Uranus moving into Gemini, there's the other side. It's about variety. It's about excitement. It's about change. And with Uranus moving into Gemini, over the next 6 years or so, it will stay in Gemini. And so, certain relationships might change quite radically. So if you have a new relationship over the next few years, you can't expect it to just be something, completely straightforward. Perhaps you're attracting people who are in some way unusual. And then there are your own demands to consider. You don't just want security, you also want excitement. And the two might seem to be really in contrast with each other. And I think it's going to take a long time for you to really understand what it means for Uranus to be in Gemini. And I think you're going to have to perhaps wait for Jupiter to move into Leo. Jupiter moves into Leo, from 30th of June onwards, and when Jupiter moves into Leo, that means that you're going to be ready for a sort of a new level of excitement. But for the moment, Jupiter is in Cancer, so let's not exaggerate the impact of Uranus in Gemini yet. Although Venus is moving into Gemini in the last week of April, and with Venus in Gemini, that does say something about other people, and you might notice things about the people around you, something rather interesting, but it could be disturbing as well. And you certainly shouldn't make assumptions. I think that at the beginning of April, you could make assumptions about other people. You could find people who behaved in a way that wasn't too disturbing, wasn't too revolutionary, but yet by the end of April, those expectations might not hold, and you should be prepared to be surprised. But just because someone does something that you weren't expecting, doesn't mean that you should write them off. In fact, at some level, you are looking for something new. You are looking for excitement, and you're looking for something that just takes you beyond your sort of everyday life. And I think that that's what you can find with Venus and Uranus in your opposite sign at the end of April. Capricorn. The month starts with a full moon in Libra, and this full moon could be a challenge. It's kind of forcing yourself to maybe move outside your comfort zone, because what has been going on is that there's been a build-up in Aries. We've had the Sun moving into Aries, at the time of the equinox at the end of March, and Saturn is now in Aries. And with these planets in Aries, you have been perhaps rather cautious. You've been thinking about your own needs, and perhaps the issues like issues of security and stability have been important to you. But it is possible to take things too far. And this full moon is saying to you, well, it's all well and good. You are looking after yourself, but there are other things that you need to address. And maybe you need to step outside your comfort zone, because things aren't as dangerous as they seem. And this full moon might well be connected with your work. I don't know, it depends on your situation, but if you have a job or if you're looking for a job, the full moon is kind of encouraging you to take things further. The current situation is fine, but maybe it could be better. And this full moon gives you a certain realization. It may be a realization that you don't really want to engage in. You'd perhaps prefer to just stay with things, as they are, not bother yourself with anything. But full moon is telling you, really, you could be taking things further, and you need to maybe make more of an effort to let people know about you, because you have got a great deal to offer, and you've always had a great deal to offer. But being a Capricorn, you can sometimes be too modest. You just don't think you're good enough, or you think that someone else could do it better. But that's not the case, and I think that is one of the messages of this full moon. And while we have this full moon, we have Venus moving into Taurus. So Venus went into Taurus on March the 30th, around there, maybe March the 31st, depending on your time zone. So April started with Venus in Taurus, and that's a great place for Venus to be in. Venus is in its own sign in Taurus, and so Venus has just left Aries. So it could be said that your sort of peak introversion was really at the end of March. And now that Venus is moving into Taurus, into an earth sign, you are an earth sign. And so there's a certain comfort about Venus being in Taurus. You're starting to become aware of new possibilities. There are things that actually you'd like to try out. You'd like to show the world what you can do, but part of you is also holding back. And Venus in Taurus is when it moves into Taurus, it's making a square to Pluto just after the full moon. Venus square Pluto, and so Venus square Pluto might be about you hiding something, or just coming up with reasons why you can't do something. You can't do it just because it might be inconvenient, it might be difficult, it might cost too much, whatever. But you may just be making excuses. And the reality is, Capricorn, that there are things that you can do, and you can do them really, very well. And so, give yourself the best possible chance. And, and during the first half of April, until I don't know, the aspect becomes exact on the 13th. We've got a sextile between Venus and Jupiter. So when Venus moves into Taurus, it starts to make a sextile to Jupiter, becomes exact on April the 13th. And, this Venus sextile Jupiter, it's a good aspect for everyone. The two fortunate planets, the two benefics in sextile with one another, things are good. And there are lots of things that you can benefit from. You can benefit from other people. Don't underestimate other people. You don't have to do everything on your own. And Jupiter, has been in Cancer, your opposite sign, since last summer. And one way of looking at Jupiter in Cancer, Jupiter exalted in Cancer, is to say that, well, it is about how you can potentially benefit from other people. And with Venus sextile Jupiter, that suggests to me that you can get a lot of support for whatever you're doing. So you're not alone. The support is there. And so it really is important that you are ambitious. Now, around the 17th, sort of mid-April, I think it's the 17th, there is a new moon. So the moon is kind of been sort of waning, getting smaller through the first half of April. Then you've got the new moon on the 17th. And this new moon is in Aries. And so this new moon can represent a new beginning. And you sort of looking at things afresh and starting to see what is possible, and also starting to think about what might have been holding you up. And this new moon could relate to your home and how you're feeling about your home. You have a particular attitude to your home, and it doesn't really matter whether it's your own home or whether you rent it. You start to see new possibilities, and these possibilities might also be connected with your family with this new moon. And so if you've got involved in your home with particular routines, and you had a particular attitude, and you might want to change things. In certain situations, a new moon can represent a new home. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. And this new moon is in late degrees. It's at 27, 29 Aries. So it might be that something is coming to an end, and something is coming to an end so that it can be replaced with something else. So if you start to think that you'd be happier somewhere else, then fine. That might be an appropriate reaction. Now, just after this new moon, we have a conjunction between Mars and Saturn and Mercury, actually. So this Mars-Saturn-Mercury conjunction, on 19th, 20th, something like that, is not easy. I mean, you think about it. Saturn is your ruler. It is being conjuncted by Mars. It's also being hit by Mercury, and the question is, how does it work? Now, Mars could represent something really annoys you. Could be another person annoys you. I've talked about the home, and the fact that this conjunction takes place just after the new moon. It might be there's something very annoying about your family or your home, and you want to do something about it. You want to make a change, and so be perhaps careful in your home. Although maybe you're seeing things for the way they are. You're getting information here, and if something isn't working, if something is just frustrating you, is annoying you, then maybe that is a sign that a change is required. But with this Mars-Saturn conjunction, in that this whole period, I don't know, between the 15th of April through the 25th of April, while that Mars-Saturn conjunction is around, you do need to be careful in your home. I mean, it's not a time for taking risks in your home, playing with plumbing or electricity or moving heavy objects and being diplomatic with your family. I think that would be a good idea. And also Mars-Saturn conjunction. If you are feeling bad with this Mars-Saturn conjunction. By the way, I'm not saying you should feel bad. I absolutely do not want to create self-fulfilling prophecies. It's just astrology. I may have got it wrong. I often get it wrong. But if you are feeling bad and you're feeling negative, it's just something passing. It's not going to last forever. And then the end of the month, we have Uranus moving into Gemini, and Uranus moving through Gemini. You had Uranus moving into Gemini through Gemini a bit last year. Then it moved retrograde. It moved back. It moved out of Gemini back into Taurus, and so now it's here. It's in Gemini for the next six years or so. Sorry, I should have looked up the precise moment it moves into Cancer. But you don't worry about Uranus moving into Cancer. No, that's not for years. So with Uranus moving into Gemini, you feel that something needs to change. I've already talked about this view that maybe your home needs to change. Yeah, that doesn't mean you have to move out, but you just have to change something about your home. And of course, when you're talking about home, you're also talking about routines and the kind of patterns you've given yourself, and you've perhaps got used to certain patterns. And now with Uranus moving into Gemini, you're thinking about it. You're thinking again. You're thinking again about it. And the question is, have you been doing things in the right way? Maybe you want to just get rid of an old routine, something you've been doing same time every day for years. Maybe it needs to end, and maybe you need to start doing something new. So that is a way of looking at it. Another way of looking at Uranus in Gemini might be a bit quirky. A lot of people have pets. They have dogs, cats, whatever. And Uranus in Gemini, some Capricorns might be thinking about doing something, perhaps having a new pet, having a new animal in the house, a small animal. I'm not talking about large animals like horses. I'm talking about basically animals that are smaller than a goat. I have to be technical about this. It's to do with Gemini. I mean, Gemini in the Capricorn chart represents the sixth house, and the sixth house is traditionally to do with pets, but not large. It's not whales. Whales are to do with the 12th house, and horses are to do with the 12th house. So you might want to introduce have a new pet, but think about it carefully, because Uranus can be disruptive, and so creating those kind of changes might be a problem. Now, if you are a wealthy Capricorn, you're the kind of Capricorn that has servants. I mean, I'm kind of exaggerating here. I'm kind of reading too much into this, but the sixth house can be about servants as well. So if you're wealthy enough to have servants, so do think very carefully about who you hire to do work around the house or whatever over the next few years, because there might be some surprises. But I'm probably reading too much into this. Aquarius, we have planets moving into Taurus. Well, specifically, the April starts with Venus moving into Taurus. I mean, Venus moved into Taurus on March the 30th, and then sort of later in April, the Sun moves into Taurus. And Venus moving into Taurus, it can be quite grounding. And Venus stays in Taurus until the end of April, I think, until 23rd, 24th of April. And so, with Venus moving into Taurus, it's possible that you appreciate some stability in your life. That's what you're looking for. And Venus is also, it's a planet connected with with aesthetics, how things look. And so, as far as your home is concerned, you might be quite sensitive to what things look like, and decoration, I don't know, curtains, whatever, that might matter. And so you're going to perhaps want your home to be somewhere that is an object of beauty. And Venus moving into Taurus, I regard that as being something quite favorable to anything to do with home, real estate, whatever it is. It should work pretty well for you. This might not be something that you're necessarily interested in, but perhaps you should make the effort. It gives you a new side to things. Not every Aquarian is particularly interested in what things look like. I mean, Aquarius is is an air sign. It can be about the mind and how the mind is operating, and thoughts, and thinking about the home might not be the first thing that comes to mind, but it's certainly something you consider, and perhaps you do need some beauty in your life. It might make a difference. And while this is going on, we've got a sextile between Venus and Jupiter. So Venus in Taurus is making a sextile to Jupiter in Cancer, and it really is kind of more of the same. It's saying that you can actively make things look good, and in fact by making things look good in a very disciplined kind of way, you are kind of boosting your own luck. It may also be about appearance. I mean, Venus is a planet to do with appearance, and if you pay attention to what things look like, then I do think that you could be attracting some good luck. Now, in the middle of April, well, towards the end, I mean around the 19th, 20th, we do have a conjunction between Mars and Saturn, and I'm slightly concerned about this conjunction between Mars and Saturn. I mean, it's not personal to you, Aquarius. Having Mars and Saturn and Mercury making a conjunction is, it's quite a heavy influence. And so you think that, Mars is aspecting Saturn. Mars is your ruler. And this conjunction, okay, how could it work? You might have to be careful about travel. Do you have any travel plans around the 19th and the 20th? But I'm not really talking about long distance travel. Short distance travel, between, let's say, I don't know, the 15th and the 25th of April. Be careful. Make sure that everything has been worked out, and perhaps you shouldn't indulge in unnecessary traveling. Whether it's by car, bicycle, bus. If you don't need to go somewhere, don't do it. And make sure that if you own a car, that your car is in good working order. And additionally, be careful what you say. With Mars making a conjunction to Saturn and Mercury involved as well, the words you use could be unfortunate. They might be provocative. It's not like you may mean to be provocative, but, being an Aquarius, you can be quite logical, and you like to say things as they are, and you say something that seems right, but you get a negative response. It's not necessarily appreciated, and, it works both ways. You could say something that offends another person. Someone else could say something that offends you. And so, just be very careful with your choice of words. And I'm sorry to, be a bit negative there, but I think it does have to be pointed out. Now, end of April, we've got two planets moving into Gemini. We've got Venus moving into Gemini, and we've got Uranus moving into Gemini. Uranus moving into Gemini, well, that is a big deal. Now, if you believe that Uranus rules Aquarius, well, I don't believe that Uranus rules Aquarius. As far as I'm concerned, Saturn rules Aquarius. But I do understand that some people listening to this will think that Uranus rules Aquarius, in which case you would be very excited about the fact that Uranus is moving out of Taurus and into Gemini. And it doesn't really matter. The point is, Uranus is moving into an air sign. Gemini is a sign which Aquarius has an affinity with, and it stays there for 6 years or something like that. I haven't checked precisely when Uranus moves into Cancer. So this is a part of your chart which is exciting. It's very creative, and maybe you need to take things further. You are a very interesting, individualistic person. But how far have you taken things recently? You kind of got an inkling last year of what you were capable of doing, but were you able to see it through? Well, probably not. But now with Uranus and Venus moving into Gemini, well, Venus really tells you about, the shape of things to come, how things may develop. And so that Venus and Uranus in Gemini really does allow you to really make the most of what you've got. And if you do something well, you find yourself doing something really well, then that may say something about what you can achieve over the next few years. Pisces. I think the beginning of April looks pretty good. So in late March, Venus moved into Taurus. Venus is a fortunate planet, and Taurus is the sign it rules. And when Venus moves into Taurus, it starts applying to a sextile of Jupiter, and Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. And this Venus-Jupiter sextile is exact on April the 13th. So during that first part of the month, as Venus and Jupiter move closer and closer towards one another, things should really look good. I mean, Jupiter is your ruler. Jupiter rules Pisces, and so with Venus making that sextile to your ruler, things should really be coming together. And I think you have a chance to be quite lucky. And it's not just luck. You do have the opportunities to show your skills and to also show your sensitivity, because it's not just about Venus making a sextile to Jupiter, it's also the fact that Mercury is making a trine to Jupiter. And so, Mercury is in Pisces, it's in your sign, at least it starts the month in your sign. It's making a trine to Jupiter. Again, we know that Jupiter is well placed, and so with Mercury trine Jupiter, you don't necessarily have to say much to get your message across. It's this Mercury trine Jupiter is taking place, in water signs. So yeah, there's a lot of sensitivity, flying around. You can pick up on other people's thoughts and feelings. There may even be something psychic or telepathic about this connection. And additionally, this trine between Mercury and Jupiter can be connected, with relationships. I mean, Mercury rules Virgo, your opposite sign, and Jupiter's your ruler. So you could see Mercury making the trine to Jupiter as being about relationships, working well. You and someone else finding a lot of things in common. So Pisces, don't feel that everything has to be done on your own. You are someone who gets attention, without having to shout. In fact, I think you come over really as being, a pretty pleasant person. So, I mean, overall, I'm thinking that April, shouldn't be a bad month, and there's no need to exaggerate. There's no need to overdo it. Okay, there may be times when you feel you should be overdoing it. For example, on April the 5th, which I think that's Easter Sunday. There's a square aspect between the Sun and Jupiter. You might want to take something too far. Sun and Jupiter can be quite an indulgent aspect. Could be about financial overindulgence. Sun in Aries square Jupiter, or emotional overindulgence. But there's no need to try too hard. And I think that is an important message about April. Now, as April develops, some things do change. The month started off with Mercury and Mars in your sign in Pisces, but on the 9th, Mars moves into Aries. On sort of the 14th, 15th, Mercury moves into Aries. Have I got that right? So the 9th, Mars moves into Aries. On 14th, 15th, Mercury moves into Aries. So you have these planets moving out of your sign and into Aries. And what does that mean? It could be, Pisces, that you do have to start thinking about money in a new way. And, with Mars in Aries, Mars is about assertion. There's always somewhere where we've got to be assertive. And from a financial perspective, something might demand your attention. And you can't just let it slip. And so, mid-April, you might have to defend your position. If you feel that something is owed to you, then be clear about it. You don't want to be taken advantage of, and there's no reason to be taken advantage of. Even though Mercury and Mars are moving out of Pisces, the North Node is still there, still in your sign, and with North Node in Pisces, that is about you putting your own interests first. Now, around 19th, 20th, 19th, whatever, we've got a conjunction between Mars and Saturn. And this Mars-Saturn conjunction is in Aries. It could be difficult, and it might just go back to what I was talking about with money. Something might crop up financially, and it might not be very pleasant. But, just because it's not pleasant doesn't mean you should just ignore it. And if you're ready to bite the bullet with Mars-Saturn, with this Mars-Saturn conjunction, really demand what is owed to you, but in a way that is, sensitive. You're using that Piscean approach. Pisces is not a weak sign. Sometimes you get the idea that Pisces is the ocean and it flows this way and that, but you can be successful as a Pisces. Rupert Murdoch, he's a Pisces, isn't he? So yeah, you can be demanding, and if you do feel that you're under pressure, that something is owed to you, that someone is being unreasonable, then maybe you can take advantage of this Mars-Saturn conjunction. Everyone is going to be feeling a bit nervous, and if you can just keep your cool at a time of tension, you may be able to really use this event. And then, at the end of the month, we have got Uranus and Venus moving into Gemini. Now, Venus doesn't stay in Gemini for too long, just a few weeks. I'm not quite sure when Venus moves out of Gemini into Cancer. But I haven't really kind of looked ahead. I should have done, but I haven't. But Uranus will stay in Gemini for, 6 years or so. Uranus briefly went into Gemini last year, and now it's back with a vengeance. And so, what does that mean? And this could be about you thinking about your home, where you feel comfortable, where you feel secure, where you live. Could be about your family. And Uranus is a destabilizing energy. It doesn't mean to say it's a bad energy, it just can be destabilizing. It stirs things up. And Uranus can bring radical change. And you may be looking at where you are living and you're thinking, well, this just isn't good enough. You should be living somewhere else. Or you want to make some big changes about where you're living. So you don't necessarily have to move, but you can you can just make some alterations. But we're not talking about minor alterations. And it could just be about your whole attitude to your home and your family over the next few years. And Venus moving through Gemini just might give you a taste. You just may see evidence that something does have to change. But don't worry about it. I think it's a change which will be a change for the better. So yeah, no reason to be concerned about it. And overall, Pisces, I think it should be a pretty good April, and particularly the beginning of April. Beginning of April looks really good. So do try to make the most of it. And that's it. Those are my forecasts for April 2026. I hope you have a great month. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description. And I will talk to you again very soon.